Wild Wine Life. We are here with Frederick Ryan, the author of Wines of the White House. Now, Fred, President Johnson was the first to really use American wines. How much of I read and heard it was more in response to his being a little bit irked that de Gaulle had withdrawn from NATO. Can you kind of confirm, or I mean, there's the miss you hear, and then there's the reality. So here's where I would like to hear the reality.
Well, you're right. President Johnson did make a significant step in advancing American wines in the White House. They'd gone back a little bit. They started to appear maybe with greater frequency during Eisenhower, but they were more of a novelty. It would be, well, this isn't too important of an event, so let's serve an American wine. But if it's a really important event, let's serve a French wine. And then Kennedy was pretty much on the French side. Then Johnson came and California wine was coming of age. That was the era of the Mondavis and the Chapelets and the Charles Krug winery was, and all these great iconic California wines were coming of age. And the California wine industry created what they called the Wine Institute in Washington, and its mission was to promote California wine. And they were sending cases of California wine over to the White House, and President Johnson would serve them at state dinners. So he, with very few exceptions, he served California wine and made it kind of the norm at the White House. Nixon, of course, as we talked previously, was he knew the wines of the world. He loved German wines. He loved French wines. So he would mix the European wines with the American wines. And then it became with Ronald Reagan, it became all American wines, mostly California. But now, as you know, wine is produced in all 50 states, and different presidents will serve a wine from their state. For example, Gerald Ford from Michigan. The only time Michigan wine's ever been served at the White House was when President Ford was president. President Bush served some wines from Texas. So each president, has that flexibility to serve a wine from their home state if they would like to.
Now, in your book, I do have to thank you for giving a little kudos to Missouri, saving the world wine industry with our rootstock. But I was very hurt that, pre-prohibition, we were winning world competitions with some of our wine, and we even have a legitimate legal ice wine. Not all of our wines are sweet. We've won Jefferson Cup tastings. How does the Missouri Great Board get some of the wines submitted to the White House? Do they follow California's lead and just ship a bunch of cases over there?
Well, maybe they could start by getting a Missourian elected president of the United States. That would give a lift to it.
That would give a lift?
Right.
See, I was kind of disappointed. I think Truman came in too soon after Prohibition.
Yeah.
He was Mr. Bourbon and Branchwater, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Truman was serving limited wines, because you have to remember, if you look back, the wine industry in America, and you mentioned Prohibition, it had some rough times. You had Prohibition from 1920, 1931, and that basically shut down most of the wineries, because unless they were making it for religious purposes, they went out of business. So that shrunk the number of wineries. Then you have World War II, which limited the imports. And of course, we were focused on winning the war, and the wineries were not thriving and growing at the rate they were. So World War II ends, Truman's president, and we're basically a cocktail nation. We're drinking cocktails and not wines. And wines just started to come back. And the Truman administration served American wines on a limited basis. Actually, the Roosevelt administration began serving American wines, and the rule was the wines had to be domestic and inexpensive, which at that time was not a good combination, because the wines were not so great. And I found the notes of one of the members of Roosevelt's cabinet, Secretary Ickley, who said, "I was just at the White House. The wines that Mrs. Roosevelt serves are terrible, and the sparkling wine is undrinkable." That was early stage American wines. Now, of course, they rival the best in the world.
I was talking to Chef Roland years ago, and he was mentioning to me about what you also mentioned in the book as a rumor, but he actually told me about Nixon having his Chateau Margaux in a napkin, serving American wines to everybody else, which was kind of also reverse of LBJ. I heard used to have scotch in his bourbon bottles. Can you tell everybody what pulling a Nixon is?
Yes, this rumor had gone around for a long time that Nixon, who knew wine, would pick a very nice wine for all the guests at the event. If it's a steak dinner or a party or something, he'd pick a very nice wine. And then over in the corner, there would be a wine steward with another bottle of wine with a little towel around the label. And that wine steward would only serve that wine to President Nixon. And the rumor was that he would pick special wines and that were better than everyone else's. And I'd heard this. I talked to the Nixon people. I talked to the permanent White House people. And some were saying it's true. Some were saying, no, it's just a myth. I finally confirmed it with no source less than Woodward and Bernstein that Nixon indeed would serve a separate wine, and they had the information. It was a 1966 Chateau Margaux, which was his favorite, that would be served only to him while everybody else had a different wine. And I've told this story to a few people at events, and they'll start laughing. And the term is called pulling a Nixon. And when I tell this, people start laughing and say, my daughter got married recently, and I pulled a Nixon. They had a separate bottle for the head table, and everybody else had something else. So maybe in our lives, each of us at some point or another may have pulled a Nixon.
I also like the fact how Prime Minister Churchill was exempt from the drinking limit rule.
Well, you can't talk about wine or alcoholic beverages without talking about Winston Churchill. And I did find the records when he came to the White House to visit President Roosevelt, and I was wondering what was served, and I found the records that at each meal of the day, there were different beverages served, from sherry, scotch, champagne, brandy, wine, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, different combinations. But I learned one thing in the book, as you've seen when you go through it, is I found all these short little interesting quotes, and I thought these are things that people who are making toasts might want to have in mind, a little quote when they make a toast or a little story to tell. So I spread them every couple pages on the book. There's a little wine glass and 2 or 3 sentences of a quote from somebody, a president or statesman or somebody big in the wine world. And one of my favorites, you mentioned Winston Churchill, was a quote by Winston Churchill. And as you know, there are different size wine bottles. There's a regular size and there's the Magnum and larger. So Churchill's quote was that a Magnum of wine was the perfect size for 2 gentlemen to enjoy over lunch, especially if one is not drinking. So it was a classic Churchill quote. So that's in there.
Did you ever meet Andrei Telechev when he came to the White House or during any of your visits to Napa?
I did. I met him. He was a friend of Ronald Reagan's. He would come to the White House every once in a while. Andrei Telechev had been the mastermind of Bulia Vineyards going back to the late 30s. He started there. He produced the George de Latour Private Reserve. He was considered one of the true giants in the wine world, and a very, very nice man. And he and his wife, Dorothy, would come to visit the White House, see President Reagan, and I would meet them beforehand. We'd have lunch together, or we would get together and just talk about wine, and then he would come and see President Reagan for a few minutes, and they'd catch up. But he was one of the greats in the history of California wine, and leaves a wonderful legacy.
What I also liked was you also had a couple different wineries that I actually have one here from Carneros della Notte, where I'll have to, where it was served to one of the. This one was served to the Obamas, and they were allowed to have that etched. And that's one of the neat things is even when it's not an official state dinner, there's a lot of connections out there, and it's nice to see that continuation. You hear some people saying, "Oh, I'm going to support this type of wine publicly," but as a person out in the field, you hear what is special ordered when somebody comes to town and stays at a hotel or goes somewhere, which I always thought was really neat. Uh, the other thing I really liked about your book, you the glassware is absolutely gorgeous. The history of the glassware throughout the White House. Now, as a person who loves using Riedel, uh, I'm looking at that. I'm like, well, it's not the best for wine, but the visual aspect of this glassware with the emblems and how it evolved over the years. How much fun was that researching?
It was very interesting. In fact, I devoted an entire chapter of the book to the glassware of the White House. And the reason was, as you're mentioning, you look back early in our history, and here we were a young country. We were trying to show the world that we'd arrived. We had a beautiful mansion, the White House, although it wasn't called the White House at the time, it was called the Executive Mansion. And we were trying to furnish it with great world-class art and furniture. And we wanted to show when world leaders arrived that we were a serious country too. So presidents would order this spectacular glassware, very ornate, engraved with the presidential seal, engraved with birds and other beautiful scenes, and glasses, decanters, the whole set. Abraham Lincoln. If you go to the White House now, you see Abraham Lincoln's decanter, and you see different all the way up through much of our history. And it was a way to say we are an important country too. And I'll tell you one thing, though, a lot of people don't know is today, if you go to the White House, you'll for an official event, you'll dine off of the state china, and we different presidents have purchased china over the years. The White House has a lot of china. You'll have beautiful silverware. You have all the beautiful surroundings, but the glasses will be rented from a caterer because there is no longer a big enough collection of White House glassware for an event of any scale. So the last time glassware was bought was President Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy bought glassware, and hopefully another president or first lady for a first gentleman at some point will order new glassware. So when you come to the White House, when we showcase great wine, we'll showcase great china, we'll showcase great glassware to enjoy the wine.
Now, the proceeds from Wines of the White House, that goes to the White House Historical Society.
It's yes, the White House Historical Association is a group that Jacqueline Kennedy started back in the early '60s, and its purpose is to acquire important pieces that the White House needs, pieces of art, things that stay at the White House. But secondly, to educate the public about the institution of the White House. It's nonpartisan. It's just about letting Americans know about their presidency, their first ladies, and it's we sell every year. We sell the White House Christmas ornament that a lot of people have seen, and that's a source of funding that funds this educational work. But when I did the book, I decided I wanted every cent to go to educational purposes to a nonprofit. So I got underwriting for the research, the publication, the printing. So when someone buys a copy of that book, every penny goes to educating the American public about the White House.
And how can someone order the book for themselves and enjoy the historical story? And if someone wanted a book signing event or a big wine dinner with you to come to town, how do they get a hold of you?
Well, the book is available on Amazon, and it can be just like any other book. You can have it tomorrow, and it's also sold by the White House Historical Association in Washington D.C. If you go to whitehousehistory.org, you can find it.
And then do you ever travel for any big events or anything like that?
If if groups are putting together an event where they're acquiring a large number of books so it benefits the educational programs at the White House from time to time, I've tried to find a way to be there and maybe participate in the evening, talk a little bit about the book, and lead them through the tasting.
Okay. Well, Fred, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. I know you have a busy day ahead of you. I hope I can get you to come back or share a glass of wine if I'm ever. I'll bring something cool if I'm ever in DC with the kids.
I would
Uh,
look forward to it, to both.
uh, thank you so much. I'm Ray. Don't forget to live the dream, and here's to living the wild wine life.